Hi, everybody. My name is Dave McClure. I'm a senior security architect at Cerner. I've been spending quite a few years now trying to protect the privacy of your healthcare information. Um, I've done a lot of different things across the realm of information security, but privacy actually is not an area that I've focused in specifically um, up until, well, up until more recently. But this talk didn't really come out of my professional experience as much as it came out of a private journey. I became interested in and concerned about online privacy some time ago, and in discussion with a couple of friends, we started kind of investigating this together. And this talk really grew out of my own journey of understanding um, privacy online today, and what's happening across the world today, how the advertising industry works. And so that's kind of the context for it. This is called What's Leaking, Why It Matters, and How to Slow the Drips. It's all about personal privacy in the surveillance economy. So before I really launch into this, I would encourage you to go ahead and double click on the slides. There should be an indicator there. If you double click on the slides, it'll make the slides larger and it'll make my talking head smaller. I think that'll work out well. You don't need to see my face as much as you need to see the slides. So let's dive in. First of all, I want to make it very clear what the scope of this talk is. As I mentioned, this is really about personal privacy. It's about thinking about privacy from an individual consumer's perspective. It's about privacy on your personal devices that you own and your home that you control in a non-employment context. So I'm not going to get into talking about politics or government, law enforcement, or anything that you do on your employer's devices or your employer's networks. Your employers have the right to monitor what's going on their devices, and you signed on the dotted line that you agreed with that when you agreed to take money in exchange for your work. So this is not really talking about all those other things. This is about you and your personal life. The year is 1842, and financial institutions have a problem. Up until this point in time, lenders, the people who had the money, and the borrowers, the people who needed the money, lived and worked pretty much in the same communities, really in the same localities. And so oftentimes those decisions about who to lend money to and how much to lend to them and what the repayment terms were going to be was all kind of done on a firsthand knowledge basis. If a banker wanted to know the reputation of a particular potential borrower, all they did was walk down the street and kind of observe their work habits. They talk to people in the community who knew them and find out what they were like and learn their reputation that way. And that's generally how those types of decisions were made and how those business arrangements were put together. But actually, this was documented by Philly's own Benjamin Franklin. But as time went on and America began to expand west, that distance between the borrowers and the lenders became bigger, and it became bigger to the point where the lenders really didn't have a good opportunity to get firsthand knowledge of the borrowers anymore. So some people put their heads together, and an enterprising young man came up with an idea of creating a network of embedded locals in those distant communities. So the communities that were cropping up 100 miles away, 1,000 miles away, he decided to go travel around and recruit a network of people who already lived in those communities, who already knew firsthand who those potential borrowers were, and then would document their reputations, document what they were like in terms of their business habits, and send that information back to the financial institutions, which were typically on the East Coast in larger cities. And then they would build a literal physical file system of the reputations and the credit risk of those distant borrowers. So a young man named Louis Tappan really formed the first company that did this sort of thing. He called it the Mercantile Agency. And this agency was a big success. It was such a big success that actually some competitors cropped up. Um, Interesting tidbit of history. One of the mercantile agents that was embedded in a distant locality was a young lawyer from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln. For a time, he worked for the Mercantile Agency. Well, time went on. The business succeeded, and as happens, the business was sold and bought and sold again, and eventually it was acquired by a guy named Dunn. And as the decades went on, they merged with another business, and that business that originally started as the Mercantile Agency back in the early 1840s actually still exists today. We know it as Dun and Bradstreet. And they're still basically in the same business, gathering information on people to provide credit reporting. So the business model itself was actually a big success, and it was able to scale along with the country as the country scaled. However, new business model, new problems. Not every one of the mercantile agents was completely ethical in what they did. Some of them realized they were kind of in a position of power, and so some of them would occasionally use their power to maybe act in unseemly ways. Some of them weren't necessarily careful in the information that they recorded and sent back. Sometimes rumor and innuendo was sent back, or just plain old inaccurate information was sent back to the home office. So you can imagine how difficult it must be to correct information in those days. If you've had to go through a situation where you needed to correct an inaccuracy in your credit reporting today, sometimes that can take a long time to get done, even today with all of our modern tools and technologies. Imagine what it must have been like back in those days when, at least in the early times of this business model, there wasn't even a railroad that connected one end of the country to the other. And then, of course, there was an additional problem that just simply didn't exist anymore. There were business owners out in those localities who had no interest in borrowing money from big lenders. They had no need to do that. They were doing fine on their own. And yet, information was routinely gathered about them and written up and sent back to the East Coast somewhere. And some of these folks really took issue with that. So eventually, a couple of people actually wrote an article about this, and they called attention to some of these problems with this new business of credit reporting. And as you can see, basically, they blamed the new business method, right? This distributed network that recorded information about people. And they also blamed recent inventions for this problem. And in that case, at the day when this was written, it was photography that was new technology, but also it was largely circulated newspapers were new technology at the time. And the way they characterized it was that these new things have invaded the sacred precincts of private and domestic life. And the problem was that what is whispered in the closet, presumed to be private, intended to be private, shall be proclaimed from the housetops. Well, obviously that sounds like it's kind of dated language. That's because it was written in 1890. Near as I can tell, now I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a professional researcher, but as near as I can tell, this is the first really disciplined argument from the law, actually from several of the U.S. constitutions, that there was, in fact, a right to privacy inherent in the U.S. Constitution. As you can see, it's been a long time. And even from the beginnings of this business model, privacy concerns were outlined and were written up in a very prestigious law journal. So why the history lesson? Well, Basically, it's to make these 2 points. Commercial information gathering has been woven into the fabric of the US economy from the beginning, really before the US even existed during colonial times. This has been happening long before you and I came into existence, and it's here to stay, and it's not going away. It's going to be here long after we're gone. We need to get used to that. But on the other hand, it is clear from law that US citizens do have a right to personal privacy. This right, as it was outlined in 1890, has been tested multiple times in court cases, and it's been tested actually in quite a bit recently over the last 50 years ago in a number of different cases, up to and including Supreme Court cases. So how do we resolve the tension between these two truths? Commercial enterprise has the right to gather information about people. It's been part of our economy since the very beginning, but we have the right to maintain privacy over information about us in some way. How do we live together with those two truths? Well, a lot of it, unfortunately, is really decided in case law. Now, early on, the lines had to be drawn, and the lines were drawn early on when newspapers and that new business model were the only things to be concerned about, and photographs. Fast forward to today with the invention of smartphones and the internet, and how all business is now being conducted in those mediums and across that, with all the sensors that are included. Everybody has a camera and a video camera and a voice recording device in your pocket now. How are the lines redrawn? Have they been redrawn in the right places? Well, that's up to you to decide, and up to the courts to decide. One of the things that we need to do to kind of figure our way through that is to understand the attitudes and motives of the players, commercial enterprise, and also of the individual. So we're going to start with you. In order to think through this, you really need to understand where you are on this continuum of privacy. How concerned are you about privacy? So I've thrown a few representative locations here up on a continuum, and I'm just going to talk through each one of them and think about these and kind of figure out where you think you are in reality right now. First off, all the way on the left is the targeted ad lover. There are people who are actually excited about the fact that they don't have to slog through ads for things that they're not interested in. They like the fact that commercial entities know what their interests are, and they get the score of the games that they're really interested in when they first open Google. People like that sometimes. If you're in that space, it's totally okay. That's a legitimate place to be. I'm not quite sure why you're here at this talk, other than maybe you think you have this nagging feeling that maybe there should be something that you're concerned about. And if that's the case, it's fine. You've come to the right place. Probably the majority of us are common consumers. We know, because we've read the stories and we've heard the reports in the news, that there have been terrible privacy violations at times as a result of modern technology. But maybe you haven't been the victim. Maybe this hasn't happened to you, but you're concerned about it and you just don't know what to do. We're going to talk about that. You've come to the right place. We're going to talk through that, and hopefully we'll help you learn what it is you need to be concerned about and what some things you may do in response to that. Then you have the targeted ad hater. Some of you are well aware of the news stories. You know that you get creeped out already when you search for a particular item in Google, and then within minutes, your social media feeds are filled up with ads for those particular items, and you log on to Amazon and you're seeing ads for that item too. And you get a little bit creeped out by that. Again, you've come to the right place. We're going to get to the how-tos late in the talk, and I'll point you to additional resources to go to get information about tools and techniques and tactics that you can use to push back against that. Some of you might be more along the lines of civil libertarians, where you're thinking about it beyond just a consumer thought process, and you're thinking about some of the larger issues surrounding civil society and freedoms, and you're concerned about it from that perspective. Some of you may be human rights, free speech advocates. Now, it might sound a little odd for me to put that particular place and highlight that here on this continuum, but there's a reason I'm doing it. A couple of months ago, an Indian company was outed for actually performing illegal hacking activities specifically targeted against human rights activists and journalists who were writing about human rights abuses, free speech advocates, and it wasn't only professionals working for organizations who were concerned about human rights. It was also journalists and also people who were just outspoken on social media for those types of for that type of advocacy. So what this Indian company appeared to be a usual type of IT services provider. If you go to their website, you see they marketed services for cloud design, helping companies design cloud solutions, security solutions, and coming alongside companies to assist them with their IT efforts. But it's not clear whether that was just a front and really the business was all the illegal hacking stuff, or whether the illegal hacking stuff was something that they just did on the side in addition to having legitimate services. But in either case, what was happening was unnamed entities were coming to them, contracting their professional level services to go hack them in illegal ways and try to stop them from the advocacy that they were doing. So if you fall into that category, you absolutely need to be concerned about your privacy. You need to be concerned about the privacy, particularly of your communication, the content of your communication, and the metadata around your communication. Remember that content and metadata. We're going to talk about those later on in the talk. And then finally, maybe you're an unplugger. You may feel like this is all overwhelming and you feel like you'd rather just stay out of social media, stay off the internet. Not too many people probably in this forum are like that, but there are people, you can see some of them on the Discovery Channel or perhaps the History Channel if you watch those types of shows, where they make very specific life choices to steer clear of modern technology for the most part and kind of minimize their exposure to that because of a philosophy of life kind of choice. Typically, if you hear those people talk about why they make those choices, usually privacy is among the factors that go into making that choice. Regardless of where you sit on this continuum, decide where it is right now, take note of it, what your attitude is about privacy. It'd be interesting to see if at the end of the talk, your place on this continuum changes. So now let's talk about the commercial entities, the people who are not you. Let's again start on the left. There are plenty of organizations and people out there who have a nonprofit motive for discovering information about people, and they're doing it because they want to make the world a better place. In the vast majority of cases, these are well-meaning people who are trying to do the right thing and trying to do a good thing. They want to act ethically, and they do. And so that's why they're all the way over on the left. Then you have companies, typically, this is the vast majority of companies who have a profit motive. They're trying to discover information about you because they're performing legitimate marketing and advertising types of activities, and they act ethically. They're interested in conforming to the law. They want to follow regulations. They have privacy policies. They're reasonable privacy policies. They're trying to do the right thing while still trying to learn as much as they can about you so they can put their products and services in front of you to get your attention. Again, those are all the way over on the left. Then you have a small number of companies who also have a profit motive, who are willing to act unethically. Not too many people around like that. I already mentioned this company who was hacking. Actually, a few years ago, I guess it was now, it's probably been 5 or 6 years ago, there was a company named Turn Inc. that was an advertising company. And what Turn was doing was they were taking advertising IDs from Android devices and Apple devices, and against the terms of service, were using those advertising IDs, and they were combining that information with injected headers that Verizon was putting into its customers' web traffic. All the unencrypted traffic coming from Verizon devices, Verizon was adding a unique identifier into the header so that they could track that activity for their own advertising purposes. Turn was able to get that information, combine it all together, and what they were doing was rewriting tracking cookies back to users' devices when those users had specifically, intentionally deleted those tracking cookies, trying to stay away from the tracking. So when they were found out, the Federal Trade Commission took action against them. If you want to go to the FTC's website, you can research that and you can find the complaint and the findings and the judgment and exactly what they were doing. But what ended up happening was the judgment came down against them and they paid the fines. And shortly after that, they sold to a company called Amobee, AMOBEE, who was the advertising arm of Singtel, Singapore Telecom. Now, just for clarity, Verizon stopped that practice after that was found out. They're not injecting the headers anymore. And, Singapore Telecom turned the Turn operation around, and they're an ethical company. But do you see the trend there where a service provider, network service provider, ISP, telecom service provider, is surveilling the activity of their clients for advertising purposes? Remember that. Then the next rollover, there are, of course, entities out there that just have criminal motives. They don't care about the law or regulations or ethics or what's right. They're just willing to do whatever it takes to find a way to steal money. And then all the way over on the right, that stuff is out of scope. Again, there are legitimate privacy discussions to be had around law enforcement and different kinds of government, but that's not for this talk today. Understanding the surveillance economy means understanding how the advertising industry works today. When you sit down at a web browser and you point your browser at a particular server, that server is called the publisher. That publisher's content server doesn't just answer your browser's request. It goes inside your browser's mouth, takes inventory of what's in there. It reaches down into the stomach contents of the browser and catalogs everything that's been there for the last few days or weeks. And then for good measure, it takes a DNA swab of your device. That's what's represented in the gray box. It packages all that information up. That's essentially called browser fingerprinting or device fingerprinting. All that information gets packaged up and it gets sent to the publisher's ad server in step 3. The publisher's ad server sends the information to the SSP, the supply side platform. The supply side platform has relationships with one or more DMPs, data management platforms. Those data management platforms take all the detail and it looks across many other data sets that it has. It looks for all the correlation points it can find and returns it. Typically by this time, your supposedly anonymous activity has been identified, actually re-identified to you. That big ball of data is then sent on to the ad exchange. The ad exchange adds hundreds of tags based on your characteristics, areas of interest, categories of interest that you've shown previously based on previous activity. And it packs all that data together and it puts it out to auction. Demand side platforms represent many different advertising agencies, and the ad agencies, of course, create advertising campaigns with and for the brands that they represent. So eventually, someone wins the bid. That information is then passed back through each step of the way. The winning bidder ends up at the publisher's ad server. The publisher's ad server in step 10 talks to your browser, and in the still open HTTP connection tells you to go grab a particular agency's ad server and grab the winning ad, which then gets served up on the web page you're trying to view. That advertising panel will often contain one or sometimes many invisible tracking pixels, and that's how advertising works. If all goes well, it takes approximately 15 milliseconds for that to get done. By way of comparison, it takes approximately 200 to 300 milliseconds for you to blink your eyes. In a very real sense, you are the product. You, your characteristics, your past behavior, your web browsing history, and everything they can find out about you is the product being sold to others. If any of you are questioning that, go out and take a look at this Netflix film, The Social Dilemma. A couple weeks ago, last I checked, that was trending at number 4 on Netflix. And even if you don't have Netflix, you can go to the link and you can look at the trailer, which includes this quote: "Everything you do is being tracked. Everything is being carefully monitored and recorded." That's for advertising purposes primarily. That's primarily what social media business model is all about. But straight from the advertiser's mouth, here's a company in the advertising space explaining some of the services they provide to their potential clients. They call this audience matched advertising. Audience matched advertising is the practice of using data that's currently linked or previously linked to personally identified information, PII, for the purpose of tailored advertising. Tailored is a nicer word than targeted, but they mean the same thing, on one or more unaffiliated web domains or apps, or on devices, right? So here you have a clear statement. We're trying to take whatever data we can get and match it back to a person. This is from a DMP, a data management platform, as identified on that previous diagram or that little video clip. This data management platform has a service that they call identity resolution. What they say is an identity is analyzed between data sets to find a match. It's a fancy way of saying that you can match a person's offline persona, their meat space personhood, their ethically sourced PII, with their online persona, mobile IDs, cookies, browsing history, device IDs, advertising IDs, CPU serial numbers. Any bit of information that they can extract from a browser or a device, they will use to try to connect that activity back to a person. So if that bothers you, if you've changed and you're concerned, now we're going to get into tools a little bit. First, we're going to talk about tool selection, or how you think through tool selection. First, there's the free versus paid question. Most of the tools that I talk about here and in the talk I'm going to point you to are free. Some of them have a freemium model where they're feature limited unless you pay. Some of them are outright paid. Whatever the case, it's a value decision for you if you want to use a privacy tool. Think about the business jurisdiction. Now, some people really want their privacy tools to be based in the US because they're familiar with US laws, they're familiar with regs, they have access to law enforcement, they know how to deal with it if there's a problem. Some people actually think exactly the opposite. Some people like their privacy tools to be based somewhere else in the world because they like the privacy legislation better in that other place, Scandinavia, Western Europe, something like that. Think about that in your selection of privacy tool, determine whether or not that matters to you. Think about the business model of the tool provider. If you're using a paid tool, there's a business behind it, and what they do and how they do it. Where do they get their money, right? Are they only about providing that tool? then you could probably, maybe you can trust what they do with your data. Maybe you can't. You need to read their privacy policy. But if their main business model is advertising, you have to question, should I really do this or not? Also, look at their business affiliations. There may be an independent operating company that provides that tool or service, but they may be affiliated with a larger conglomerate. And if that larger conglomerate has an advertising arm, you may have reason to be concerned. Credit card companies are famous for this. If you look at your credit card companies, some of those mailings that you get on policy updates and things that maybe you throw away or maybe you file away and never look, well, you should read it. Some of them will share more information with their own business affiliates, and you can't control that, but you can control what information is shared with outside entities. Look at those details. Also, obviously, the privacy policies of any privacy tool provider should be a model of clarity, of directness about what they share, what they don't share, whether they share anything at all, and what happens to your data. Also, an important question: who holds the keys? If it's a service where encryption is involved, particularly encryption of content, there may be keys involved that encrypt that data. If the service provider holds the key, they can help you recover if you lose the key, but they could also be forced by law enforcement to disclose the keys and open up your communication. They could also get hacked and lose the keys, right? So some service providers will say, we will not hold the keys. You, as the customer, must hold the key yourself. That way, we can't get to your data. You're the only one who can. The trade-off is you better not lose your key because you'll lose access to your own communication. Think through those aspects before you decide on any of these tools. Also, just because we mention a tool or listed in the slides doesn't mean it's an endorsement. I don't use all the tools I'm talking about. I use some of them. I use other ones that I didn't talk about. Also, this is not a comprehensive list of tools by any means. This is just a representative sampling to get you started. Now, at this point, we're running short on time. I can't go through all the details that I would like to. There is a longer version of this talk where I go into detail about these different spaces and these tools at the link up in the right-hand corner. This will be on the rest of those pages or on the rest of the slides as we go through. You need to think about individual device privacy. Think about the web browser you're using. Think about all these things. Again, think about your communication, metadata and content, right? Write down that link, get to it. And at this point, you want to make sure that now that you know what actions you're going to take. It's your decision. Go do it. Hey, thanks. I appreciate it. Stick around for the next talk. I think it's going to be good.
Thank you, David. Great. Thank you so much, David McClure. He is with Cerner. And this is the Technically Developers Conference, and we are at our last session of the day. I'm so excited about this one. We are going to be hearing from two esteemed journalists in their own right. Technically, Philly reporter Paige